Good evening, all, and welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week we zoom out from our adventures within the Lonely Mountain to encompass the area, the broader locale, if you will, to see the final fate of Smaug and what would be, in a more straightforward book, and a more traditional fairy tale book, the end of the story. This week, Prophecy and Politics in Fire and Water, chapter 14 of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. Thank you all so much for joining me this evening. We've got Brian, we've got Chris, and we've got Hugh, and we've got Andrea, who is enjoying her first Manhattan of the evening. Andrea, I'm trying not to hold that against you. I think that between this episode and the bonus episode which will follow this show, Patreon supporters get access to Last Call at the Green Dragon. He said, segueing effortlessly into a little bit of promotion there. Tonight there will be a bonus episode after this live broadcast in which we're going to talk some more about dragons, presumably spinning out of the conversation that we are about to have, but also about dragons a little more generally, because why would you not talk more about dragons if you had the opportunity? I just did the other Shire Reckoning episode all about dragons, and I'm still fired. I'm still all wound up. It's pretty great. Excellent. And Austin's joining us here, and Rachel's joining us too. It's a full house this evening at Shire Reckoning so that we can talk about the death of Smaug. I really loved reading this chapter again today, going into it in with some care, going into it in some depth, really looking at how the story itself moves and exactly how it pivots. And I was fascinated to learn, thanks to John Ratliff's excellent, just absolutely essential history of The Hobbit, in fact, that in the original layout of the manuscript, in the original handwritten form, this chapter was flipped with not at home. Not at home was in fact going to follow on the heels of Fire and Water. So we were going to see the fate of Smaug and then cut back to the dwarves within Erebor, kind of breaking our suspension of disbelief, kind of breaking our, if not suspension of disbelief, I suppose suspension of wonder, right? We're playing with the notions here of dramatic irony. And it's so fascinating to think of how differently this story plays out if you bounce out, if we have that vision of Smaug leaving through the main gate of Erebor, flying off into the night, and then we cut out to Lake Town and we see the fate of Smaug. Then we come back to the dwarves and Bilbo within the mountain, and we're just left, I think, with a very different tonal experiment. It's a very different thing. And I admire very much, for all that this has like a lot of the trappings of modern prestige television storytelling, right? We're going to flash back. How did we get here? This is a kind of very familiar kind of narrative structure on television. But Tolkien here, I think, wields it very, very directly and very honestly, because he is avoiding the temptation to lean into this idea of dramatic irony. Instead, we get to be with the dwarves. We get to be with Bilbo in this experience without being burdened with that additional knowledge. Brian is saying here in the chat that he likes it better in the published order, and I do too, just phenomenally so. I think it's a really deft bit of storytelling. I understand the temptation to do the contrary order. I do understand the temptation to have the audience, particularly in the more fairy tale mode, right? In this last gasp of the fairy tale mode, I understand the temptation to assure the audience that Bilbo and the dwarves are going to be safe, and then allowing them their comic hijinks of taking up the harps and playing their dwarvish song and girding themselves with armor and with weapons, all against the idea that Smaug has already fallen. But this is much stronger, it's much smarter, and it's much more direct. And of course, this that I'm discussing is, of course, our pivot out at the beginning of this chapter, our shift in the narrative voice. Not the first time that we've done it, but one of the most powerful examples of exactly this kind of narrative maneuver as we pull all the way out to see what is happening elsewhere. Now, if you wish, like the dwarves, to hear news of Smaug, you must go back to the evening when he smashed the door and flew off in rage 2 days before. The men of the lake town Esgaroth were mostly indoors, for the breeze was from the black east and chill, but a few were walking on the quays and watching, as they were fond of doing, the stars shine out from the smooth patches of the lake as they opened in the sky. From their town, the lonely mountain was mostly screened by the low hills at the far end of the lake, through a gap in which the river running came down from the north. Only its high peak could they see in clear weather, and they looked seldom at it, for it was ominous and drear even in the light of morning. Now it was lost and gone, blotted in the dark. Suddenly it flickered back to view. A brief glow touched it and faded. "Look," said one, "the lights again. Last night the watchman saw them start and fade from midnight until dawn. Something is happening up there." "Perhaps the king under the mountain is forging gold," said another. "It is long since he went north. It is time the songs began to prove themselves again." "Which king?" said another with a grim voice. "As like as not it is the marauding fire of the dragon, the only king under the mountain we have ever known." This is the morning of October 22nd, 2941 of the Third Age. And for a little, insight into, to shine a little light on that line. It is time the songs began to prove themselves again. The dwarves departed from Lake Town on October 9th, so they have been gone for almost 2 weeks, having stayed in Lake Town for just over 2 weeks. Though we must remember that when the dwarves leave, it is with the expectation of imminent success. And we're going to be talking a little, as I foreshadowed right at the beginning of tonight's session, we're going to be talking about politics, but we're also going to be talking about prophecy. And there's a real inclination, I think, as we are reading the folks of Lake Town, as we are looking at the peoples of Esgaroth, to view them as being somewhat foolish, as being somewhat impressionable, right? You'll remember, of course, that we were discussing how Thorin is hailed with songs and this suspicion of immediate victory, right? This expectation of immediate victory, that everything is now going to be all right because the rightful king under the mountain has returned. And as I say, it's tempting to view this response, and which is also, you'll remember, the response of the dwarves, with a certain lighthearted kind of mockery almost, right? Why are these people just so ready to believe in prophecy? But then we must remember that the prophecy pays out. The prophecy really cashes out with not an immediate or easy transformation of their fates, but with, in fact, exactly the transformation in their fates that they expect to happen. The mechanism of the prophecy is not quite what they expect, but the prophecy is still true. They're not wrong, per se. They're just early. We'll talk a little more about that as we move on. I'm going to quote Corey Olsen's fantastic encapsulation of the chain of prophecy that gets us exactly to the point of Smaug's demise. In the first draft, the grim-voiced man who is introduced here for the very first time and who is going to be important in a page or two is originally described as a surly-voiced man, which is a really interesting change and proof of a phenomenon that we are going to observe very carefully as we move through tonight's reading. Every time we revisit this figure, who, spoilers, turns out to be Bard, every time the narrative shifts back to him, every time the camera cuts and we are back on Bard, we get more information about him. He is more fully realized. And it's not that the narrative is drip feeding us this information. It feels as though the narrative is discovering this information. It feels as though every time we cut back to Bard, Tolkien himself has a better handle on who this guy is, for reasons which are actually pretty transparent and which we'll discuss in due course. But it's fascinating to me that this surly-voiced man is transformed into a grim-voiced man, right? Surly is a word that is reserved for very few people in Tolkien's writing. The most obvious person that I can think of who is described as surly is Ted Sandeman. So, we're not keeping good company there. Whereas grim has all of this connotation of resolve and capability, right? And also a kind of clarity of vision. There's something happening there with being unfiltered or unhazed, unfazed. There's some kind of, effect of clear perception happening here. The other concomitant effect of this transition, which I really love, is that we're moving from the adjective derived from French to the adjective derived from Old English. So we're also, through this, betraying Tolkien's linguistic preferences. So, as I say, we have this shift in our narrative voice, which is not completely unprecedented. We have done it a couple of times before. We have pulled the camera all the way out. I think in particular the capture of Thorin by Thranduil and the elves in Mirkwood. You can also make an argument for the pulling out to the eagles, right, at the end of Out of the Frying Pan and Into the Fire. There are moments here where we get shifts in perspective, but they are relatively few, and none are either as significant as this one or as I guess significant in terms of word count or significant in terms of plot event, right? This is really the major cut into our narrative voice as we've understood it through the book so far. But you can also read this, I think. I don't think I have the runway to completely go into this tonight, but it is something that we'll discuss over the course of the next few weeks, because we've talked a lot about how this part of the book signifies the transition from the fairy tale story to the fantasy story. We're going to see that more clearly than ever tonight as we actually start to deal with the consequences of living in a fantasy world, the logistical consequences, the misery that comes with life in a fantasy world versus life in a fairy tale story. But the other thing that we're really seeing here is Tolkien stylistically foreshadowing what he is going to do with The Lord of the Rings, right? We're going to see Bard, in the span of a few pages, turning from the kind of guy that you saw in the Silmarillion, right? He kind of looks like a a Hurin, a Turin, a Tuor, right? He looks like, well, maybe not that good, like a Beleg, right? Like pretty close to being that kind of guy. And then transitioning into an Aragorn figure. We really see it happen in the span of the chapter as we see the tonal shift happen. And it's really interesting to think of this narrative shift, this technique of pulling the camera all the way out and counter-positioning these two narrative strands against each other in a really interesting way that generates tension in both. That is, of course, exactly what we get throughout basically the entirety of The Two Towers and The Return of the King, right? His ability to place these stories at a kind of canted parallel course, right? They're not quite parallel because we are aware that they are going to cross again. We are aware they're generating tension as we move toward the point at which they intersect. I think it's fascinating to see how he kind of has already anticipated that narrative maneuver alongside these other narrative maneuvers that we're going to see more clearly in The Lord of the Rings. Let's get back then and take a look at what happens next. The grim-voiced man runs to the Master of Laketown and warns him that bad things are coming and is revealed to be, in very short order, of course, completely correct. The warning trumpets were suddenly sounded and echoed along the rocky shores. The cheering stopped and the joy was turned to dread. So it was that the dragon did not find them quite unprepared. Before long, so great was his speed they could see him as a spark of fire rushing toward them and growing ever huger and more bright, and not the most foolish doubted that the prophecies had gone rather wrong. Still, they had a little time. Every vessel in the town was filled with water, every warrior was armed, every arrow and dart was ready, and the bridge to the land was thrown down and destroyed before the roar of Smaug's terrible approach grew loud, and the lake rippled red as fire beneath the awful beating of his wings. Amid shrieks and wails and the shouts of men, he came over them, swept toward the bridges, and was foiled. The bridge was gone, and his enemies were on an island in deep water, too deep and dark and cool for his liking. If he plunged into it, a vapor and a steam would arise enough to cover all the land with a mist for days. But the lake was mightier than he. It would quench him before he could pass through. Roaring, he swept back over the town. A hail of dark arrows leapt up and snapped and rattled on his scales and jewels, and their shafts fell back, kindled by his breath, burning and hissing into the lake. No fireworks you ever imagined equaled the sights that night. At the twanging of the bows and the shrilling of the trumpets, the dragon's wrath blazed to its height, till he was blind and mad with it. No one had dared to give battle to him for many an age, nor would they have dared now, if it had not been for the grim-voiced man, Bard was his name, who ran to and fro, cheering on the archers, and urging the master to order them to fight to the last arrow. The last arrow, you say? We'll come back to that in just a moment. Okay, first, because I just mentioned it, we'll observe the evolution here on the page of Bard. Previously, a grim-voiced man. Now, a grim-voiced man named Bard who is taking a kind of indirect supportive action. As he's being positioned right here, he ran to and fro cheering on the archers, right? Implying very clearly that Bard is not an archer, more on that later, and urging the master to order them to fight to the last arrow. So you'll note that he is neither taking direct action nor wielding direct authority in this moment. Again, he's going to develop every time we cut back to him, which is just fantastic. There's so much power here. We could talk about this slide for, I think, our whole session this evening, just pulling out elements of Tolkien's incredible style. A hail of dark arrows leapt up and snapped and rattled on his scales and jewels, right? The onomatopoeia of snapped and rattled, just so powerful there, so immediate and physical, as well as, this kind of super physical, this kind of more metaphorical, more elemental conflict between fire and water, right? You have the idea of the fire reflected in the surface of the lake, so it's mimicking, it's giving greater power to the descent of Smaug upon Laketown, but still it's balanced because the lake cannot be defeated. The lake cannot be vanquished by Smaug. The lake will be victorious. It could quench him before he could pass through. We're also juxtaposing here the security, the watchman, I suppose, of Esgaroth here with the watchman of Erebor, right? We just completed this journey out to the guard post with Bilbo and company, and there we discovered this luxurious setup where the guards themselves, the watchmen themselves, had become complacent, had become lazy. And we talked a little last time about whether or not greater vigilance from the watchmen of Erebor would have saved more lives in the destruction of the Mountain Kingdom by Smaug. Here we get to see kind of what that looks like, right? The men of Esgaroth are prepared for the coming of Smaug, and they're prepared in this this heartbreakingly insufficient fashion, right? Every vessel is filled with water. The men have taken all of the arrows and the darts that they have. The darts here, we're thinking of javelins, of short spears in this kind of Anglo-Saxon mold, rather than the kind of darts that one might throw at a pub, for example. But they've marshaled all of their defenses, and their defenses are so completely insufficient to the task, which is, it's this beautiful counterpoint. I hesitate because obviously the scenes that we get of battle in The Lord of the Rings so exceed this kind of attack, and we don't ever really get this kind of account anywhere else in the Legendarium, not in this tone, not from this distance, right? We certainly get, I'm thinking of Glaurung and Nargothrond, as I'm sure you are too. We're thinking of the coming of the great dragons in Beleriand during the First Age, but those are in such a different register. We are so far away from the action as those events take place, even with the case of Glaurung and Turin Turambar, that we don't see the same kinds of interaction here. We don't have that same inclusivity of the human experience. And of course, we're very clearly talking about the human experience here. Brian's pointing out, no fireworks you ever imagined equal the sights that night, but Gandalf takes a stab at it 60 years later. Indeed, Gandalf takes that as a challenge. I think that's absolutely clear. It's really interesting to see. Oh, Hugh also says we can imagine the Master being pretty much a wet blanket with his leadership abilities. Hugh, that's really interesting. I want to talk about the Master and the positioning of Esgaroth in terms of its completely unique position, politically speaking, in all of Tolkien's Legendary. We'll get to that in just a moment. And Louise in Dallas is joining us here live tonight. Welcome, Louise. It's good to have you with us tonight. So, as I say, notice how we're positioning Bard here. We will talk more about that in a moment, but we'll acknowledge here the coming of that additional character detail every time we cut back to him. And of course, we're going to get the most significant character detail basically now. Let's move on to our next slide. But there was still a company of archers that held their ground among the burning houses. Their captain was Bard, grim-voiced and grim-faced, whose friends had accused him of prophesying floods and poisoned fish, though they knew his worth and courage. He was a descendant in long line of Girion, Lord of Dale, whose wife and child had escaped down the running river from the ruin long ago. Now he shot with a great yew bow till all his arrows but one were spent. The flames were near him. His companions were leaving him. He bent his bow for the last time. Suddenly, out of the dark, something fluttered to his shoulder. He started, but it was only an old thrush. Unafraid, it perched by his ear, and it brought him news. Marveling, he found he could understand its tongue, for he was of the race of Dale. Wait, it said to him. The moon is rising. Look for the hollow of the left breast as he flies and turns above you. And while Bard paused in wonder, it told him of tidings up in the mountain, and of all it had heard. So again, we cut back. Now the grim-faced man, well, previously he was running around cheering on the archers, telling the Master to urge them to keep fighting. Now he is captain of this company of archers, grim-voiced and grim-faced. They all knew his worth and courage. And not just a captain of archers here. It's not a position that he earns on merit, right? He's the heir to the throne of Dale. We've got some nepotism happening right here. He's the king who has been exiled by the destruction of Dale. We're building still further here this idea of his significance, his value, his worth. And look how we position him heroically, right? It's not just, I'm being obviously very facetious about his nepotistic inheritance of this position as captain of a company of archers here in Esgaroth. He's a descendant in the long line of Girion, Lord of Dale, whose wife and child had escaped down the running river from the ruin long ago. So let's position that very carefully. The wife and child fled. What did Girion do by implication? Girion remained. Girion stayed. Girion stood his ground, as Bard himself is standing his ground. Now he shoots with a great yew bow till all his arrows but one were spent. The flames were near him. His companions were leaving him. He bent his bow for the last time. And then the introduction of prophecy, the final manifestation of this prophetic thread that we have been following for the entire span of the book, in effect, right? And this thrush, of course, has learned this information from Bilbo. We go back to the chapter Inside Information, where Bilbo emerges from the mountain and complains first about the old thrush. He throws a stone at the old thrush, saying that it seems to be listening, but the dwarves shush him and tell him that the thrushes are magical and are to be respected, and he then tells them everything about his encounter with Smaug. Right? And we get this passage from Inside Information, quote, "All the while they talked, the thrush listened till at last when the stars began to peep forth, it silently spread its wings and flew away." And it flies here not directly, presumably, but all the way down to Lake Town so that it can communicate with the heir of Girion, Lord of Dale, with Bard, who needs to know this information. It's delivering this knowledge of this weak spot that Bilbo himself identified, right? Remember that it's not just... Well, God, I'm really tempted to segue into a discussion of passivity and activity with regard to prophecy, because it's complex. The way that we structure the prophecy and what is demanded of us in regard to the prophecy is complex, and it's not completely distinct from conversations that we have had and will have in the future about free will and how free will functions in Tolkien's, clearly deistic universe, right? We have the sense that things are ordered a certain way, but sometimes we are called upon to take action in order to fulfill that prophetic impulse. Sometimes we are not so much, right? You'll remember the moon letters on Thror's map. Tell them, urge them, command them, prophesy that they will stand by the stone. That's all they have to do. There's no actual activity there. They just have to stand in the right place, and then a thing will happen. The truth will be revealed to them. But then Bilbo has to get the information about Smaug's vulnerability, his weak spot here, and pass it to the Thrush so the Thrush can pass it directly to Bard. I take it here that... Well, there's some complexity, I think, about exactly what is happening linguistically speaking, because Bard is not even necessarily just the heir of Girion here, right? Because he is of Dale, because he was of the race of Dale, he can understand the bird's speech, which is weird and fascinating and kind of, yeah. Austin is saying right here in the chat, if you just read the page, you would think the understanding of animal speech is unique to Bard and the race of Dale. Correct me if I'm wrong, but don't others understand the speech of animals in this very book? Or are the eagles just special? See, the eagles, I think, are probably special. The eagles... So often we come back to this and related questions, and it's difficult every time to kind of pin down exactly what we make of this. Yes, talking animals exist, right? Certainly within the pages of The Hobbit. Now, we can be pretty clear, I think, from later revisions that these animals are not, in fact, talking, that this is an invention of Bilbo. This is part of Bilbo's storytelling technique as he is preparing the volume there and back again, right? It doesn't seem as though the wargs really talk. It doesn't seem as though the eagles really talk, though who's to say? What does speech even mean under these circumstances? And it is clear that the thrush is speaking its own tongue. The thrush is speaking thrush language, whatever that is, and that Bard has this... Oh, Huon the Hound, Andrea is calling out. But Huon is extremely special. He is granted the supernatural ability to speak 3 times. So, yes, I mean, but inarguably a talking animal, right? And of course we have the fox in The Lord of the Rings, who doesn't speak exactly, but articulates a thought in a way that is... literary, I suppose, that bespeaks or implies the possession of an active language there. Yeah, I'm not at all sure where we come down on this. It's simple enough to stretch to include the eagles and to say, well, the eagles can talk because they are, they are a category of special beings. They are closely associated with Manwë. They are possessed of spirits, right? Certainly if you go and you read your of Ale and Yavanna, there is the direct implication there that all the great eagles are possessed of these inbound spirits, whether they are Maiar or some other kind of spirit. See our previous discussions about that. There are interesting examples here. There's an interesting texture here. Certainly, if you're just taking the text of, obviously we're going to get to Roak the Raven next week. We're going to have the opportunity to look at a creature that speaks directly. So, we'll be able to parse that a little more clearly. But yes, by the standards of The Hobbit, there are talking animals, which makes it all the more interesting, I think, that the thrush does not talk. Or excuse me, that the thrush does not speak in a recognizably human language, though it can clearly understand human language because it gets this story from Bilbo. So it can understand Westron or whatever, variant Bilbo is talking according to Tolkien's imaginary at the time of the composition of this book. But we're unclear exactly, how these elements all fit together. It is. Yeah, Andrea saying the fox was just weird. I don't think of animals talking in these books. Yeah, by the time we get to The Lord of the Rings, all of the fairy tale talking animal elements have fallen out. The fox is a distinct counterexample and an odd one. You're absolutely right. It fits strangely in the text of that book. Austin is saying also, are the Dale men Numenorian? You think they're of the Edain, considering how much weight Bilbo puts on the race of Dale? I don't think so. But also, this is one of these questions. You know, I know I answered a question about this in the other Shy Reckoning episode this week, but this is one of the reasons that I want the 5th phase revision of The Hobbit, because it would force Tolkien to answer these questions definitively. By implication, I do think that we could probably speculate that the men of Dale are high men, as Faramir would have it, right? That they are not diminished in the way that, you know, the Rohirrim are, for example, right? The middlemen, the men of the Twilight are diminished. I think that Tolkien is cribbing some of that material in much the same way as he's cribbing, you know, some of his sense of the elves is coming from the earlier stories in the Legendarium. Some of this is filtering through our understanding of exactly how these cultures fit together. Certainly, as we're moving into the fantasy story part of The Hobbit, we're seeing a little more of the politics. We're getting a greater sense of how these people fit together. Certainly, it seems more likely to me that Thranduil et al. In Mirkwood would be trading with, you know, a great empire of men, not, you know, necessarily at their height, but still, you know, I keep thinking of that example of, you know, still elves they are and elves they remain, and that means good people, right? And maybe we can see that the men of Dale were good people. Certainly the Master of Laketown, the Master of Esgaroth, seems to be a different sort. He seems to be a different category of person. So if they are not Numenorian, and I think that if we try and fit the Hobbit into our schematic of the Lord of the Rings, then they aren't, right? They are certainly, you know, middlemen. They are the men who remained behind rather than the Edain who were gifted Numenor and then returned. But certainly that's not the aesthetic that we're getting. That's not the sense that we're getting of these men at this point, and certainly won't be by the time that we get to the Battle of Five Armies, which I think is one of those areas in which Jackson kind of dropped the ball. He was very eager to present the characters of the culture of Laketown as being lower men, right? As being middlemen, as being men absolutely of Middle Earth. But then I'm not ever really sure how completely Jackson grasped this idea, right? For all that he gives the great speech to Faramir. Chris is saying that they might be pre-Numenorian Edain. Yeah. Again, there's no real way of understanding exactly where Tolkien was in his conception of this evolution. Here's the thing that I would note, which I mentioned a little earlier, right? Operatively, one thing that we can say for sure about the Men of Dale is that they fit the middle ground between the men of the Edain through the Silmarillion and the men that we will see later at their heights of heroism in The Lord of the Rings, right? As I mentioned, Bard is positioned very well, I think, halfway between Beren and Aragorn. I think that there's a real, and not just because, you know, his victory happens and it lasts, which is something that you can't really say about any of the great heroes of the Edain back in the Silmarillion. Yeah. Austin saying, my headcanon is Dale and in turn Esgaroth are set up as a Numenorian colony, right? Certainly I think that there's some validity in that. Dale being the high men and Esgaroth being the low men. I think you're completely right about that bit of positioning, the one with regard to the other, right? Dale is clearly the higher culture, and Esgaroth much lower, but lower by necessity in an interesting way, right? We don't really, I guess we do by implication deal with that with, you know, early in the Second Age, we have the great and the good go off to Numenor and all the other men kind of sink into their medieval Dark Age, right? They sink into their Twilight world. So I guess what we're seeing is a kind of systemic approach to exactly that kind of differentiation. Yeah. We could, of course, spend forever talking about it. Yeah. Brian says, viewing The Hobbit from the perspective of it initially being a children's book provides some latitude re-talking animals. Absolutely. I don't think that they are incompatible with The Hobbit as it's presented to us. I famously, maybe not famously, maybe nobody cares that much, in fact, but to the people who know me and have heard me talk about books before, I am known as someone who does not care for talking animals. They're not my favorite thing. It is a thing that rubs up every time I read Narnia. I have real trouble with the talking animals. But within the pages of The Hobbit, because of that fairy tale mode, I think that it kind of works through at least the first 2/3 of the book. Yeah. And of course, we haven't mentioned the spiders. The other big example of the talking animals are the spiders, who don't really talk, but are, much like the thrush, capable of comprehending communication and communicating in their own terms as well. Okay, we must move on, or we will never get to the death of Smaug, which of course we absolutely have to do. So we have this, the moon is rising, look for the hollow under the left breast as it turns above you, and Bard, alone, the fire close, abandoned by his cohort, now draws the great string of his yew bow and calls upon his black arrow. Then Bard drew his bowstring to his ear. The dragon was circling back, flying low, and as he came, the moon rose above the eastern shore and silvered his great wings. "Arrow," said the bowman, "black arrow, I have saved you to the last. You have never failed me, and always I have recovered you. I had you from my father and he of old. If ever you came from the forges of the true king under the mountain, go now and speed well." The dragon swooped once more lower than ever, and as he turned and dived down, his belly glittered white with sparkling fires of gems in the moon. But not in one place. The great bow twanged. The black arrow sped straight from the string, straight for the hollow by the left breast where the foreleg was flung wide. In it smote and vanished, barb, shaft, and feather, so fierce was its flight. With a shriek that deafened men, felled trees, and split stone, Smaug shot spouting into the air, turned over, and crashed down from on high in ruin. Full on the town he fell. His last throws splintered it to sparks and gleeds. The lake roared in. A vast steam leapt up, white in the sudden dark under the moon. There was a hiss, a gushing whirl, and then silence. And that was the end of Smaug and Esgaroth, but not of Bard. Initially, as we've noted before, Tolkien's plan was for Bilbo, as unlikely as it may seem, to slay Smaug within the Lonely Mountain. But when he changed his mind and realized that no other character previously introduced would work as the Dragon Slayer without being unconvincing, right? Thorin, for example, is not quite dragon slaying potential right now, or taking away focus from Bilbo and his company, such as Gandalf returning or Beorn showing up and slaying the dragon instead. Instead, Tolkien realizes that he needs a Dragon Slayer, so he invents one. He then gifts this new hero with his special position, captain of the company of archers, with his special lineage, descended from Girion, Lord of Dale, and grants him the special black arrow forged in Erebor. But a couple of pages after his introduction, in Tolkien's initial conception, Bard still dies in the attack, right? He sacrifices his life in this very Silmarillionish way, right? He is absolutely the human hero of the First Age there, in that he gives his life to take down the dragon. All of which fits in the traditional expectations of dragon slayers: royal authority, magical weapon, heroic self-sacrifice. But then, in one of the best revisions in Tolkien's original drafts, I've talked before about how efficient Tolkien is as he is making these edits. The passage originally ended, and that was the end of Smaug and Esgaroth and Bard. And there is a break in composition where Tolkien, goes off to do some other things, but when he returns, he simply scratches out the word and replaces it with but not, and then goes back to add in the paragraph with the thrush pointing out Smaug's weakness, tying the heir of Girion to the prophecy which carries us to the Lonely Mountain in the first place. More than that, in fact, because what this really does is change the thread of prophecy that we have been talking about since we left Bag End way back when. It takes that prophecy, or it decentralizes Thorin. It decentralizes Erebor from that prophecy, and instead makes the prophecy ultimately about Bard, makes it about the slaying of the dragon. That is the ultimate prophetic payoff. And I said that I would quote the piece from Corey Olsen in exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, which is just so great because he does this with his usual brilliant clarity. Quote, "Because the dwarves and the Hobbit were standing by the grey stone on Durin's Day, the secret door was opened. Because Bilbo entered the tunnel and faced the dragon and escaped, the thrush knew of Smaug's weak spot. Because Bard is of the blood of Dale, he can understand the thrush's speech. Because Bard is brave and steadfast, he stands alone amidst the burning ruins of his town, ready to shoot his very last arrow. Because the black arrow did indeed come from the forges of the true king under the mountain, it flies true." End quote. It is a direct causal chain all the way from, well, if not all the way from Bag End, then certainly all the way from Rivendell, right? All the way to the secret door, into the mountain, back out of the mountain, the conversation which the thrush overhears, the news which is carried to Bard, and Bard here fulfilling his inbred potential. And the thing that changes here, Bard's survival, really has a huge consequence for the rest of the plot. This is a major articulation point. When Tolkien returns to this phase of composition and makes that change, right? But not of Bard, crucially, everything changes because in Tolkien's original plan, Thorin and company were going to be on the receiving end of some very poor treatment, particularly from the Elven King. There's no moral complexity in Tolkien's initial schematic of the end of this book. There's no dragon sickness. There's no growing distrust between Bilbo and Thorin. Instead, the dwarves would be malevolently besieged by people with no rightful claim on the hoard of treasure. And the resolution of that story was supposed to be the intercession of Gandalf, who would tell everyone off for behaving so badly, and then Bilbo would give up his share of treasure to the Lakemen and the elves as a way of keeping the peace. But now, with Bard positioned as the returning king, more on that in a moment, certainly with Bard positioned as Dragon Slayer, he has a right to some of the gold of Erebor, right? Some of it is kind of implied, but we'll talk a little more about his own justifications as we get to them in the chapters to come. But some of it is a little kind of Icelandic saga treasure hunt thing happening here. Right? I slayed the dragon, therefore I deserve the treasure. There's not really a legal argument being made here, but certainly as Lord of Dale, with the trading relationships between Erebor and Dale, he doesn't, and he has a legal authority based on these things, right? Some kind of legal authority, at least. He can claim some aspect of the treasure, the wealth of Erebor, but because of the destruction of Esgaroth, he also has a moral authority too, as we will see in our next slide. Hugh is saying here, it also upsets the power dynamics for the region. The dwarves get the dragon worked up enough to attack the town. Now there has to be a reckoning and balance needs to be restored. Exactly, right? Which is kind of Bard's argument. And there is a different kind of, I've been thinking about a very minor consequence of the Jackson movies today, and just thinking about how the presence of the company of dwarves and the toing and froing with Smaug within the Lonely Mountain really does change the nature of their relationship with Bard and with the Men of Laketown, right? There's a different implication being made, because you can argue in the movie versions that they don't defeat Smaug in any kind of meaningful way, but they do very directly kind of chase Smaug out of the mountain, even if only temporarily. But there's no argument that can be made that Thorin is responsible for the absence of Smaug from the Lonely Mountain or the coming of Smaug to Laketown. Not directly, at least, right? Smaug takes this himself. He goes off himself to do this. And there's no kind of claim then. Within the book, I guess this is what I'm coming down to. Within the book, I think that it is fair to say that the dwarves themselves are simply the first scavengers to descend upon the hoard of Erebor. Not completely fair, of course. They do have a right to it in the sense that it is their ancestral home. Though, again, the positioning of that is a little strange. It's a little, Austin saying, a good king is generous with his treasure. I've been rereading Beowulf, as of course we all should. Yeah. And Brian's saying, I cannot reconcile Thorin's unwillingness to compensate the folks of Dale. It just doesn't leave him and dwarves in a positive light. Exactly. This is one of the really interesting things that we can do here, because we have Bard, because we have a rightful king, right? The best kind of king, a rightful king right here with us, is that it allows us to open up this crack in Thorin's character. When they are besieged within Erebor by forces which are openly hostile to them, right? Thranduil has shown up and said, hey, you should be in my prison. B, I'll be taking that treasure. Thank you very much, right? And the men of Dale are with him. That's also, they are alongside him there. We have this unity from the dwarves. They are literally besieged and beleaguered. They are on the receiving end of this very aggressive bullying behavior, all in the name of taking their treasure. But in the absence of, well, let me revise that, in fact, not in the absence of that bullying behavior, that aggressive behavior, rather with the authority that Bard brings, with the right of Bard to at least lay claim to some portion of this treasure, we open up this space for Thorin to start behaving, well, as though he is under the influence of the Horde, as though he is manifesting dragon sickness, right? We get all of this extra complexity, and we open up the gap between Thorin and Bilbo, which is going to occupy us so fully as we move through. Yeah, Andrew is saying, interesting idea, seeing dwarves as scavengers. Yeah, I don't love that I said that. I don't love that I expressed that as bluntly as I did. Is there a better way to put it? Simply, right, if possession is 9/10 of the law, then Thorin and company have effectively taken possession of the hoard without doing the necessary narrative maneuver, right? Without performing the necessary or fulfilling the necessary task, without passing the test of slaying the dragon, right? Narratively, that is how it works. Narratively, you overcome the obstacle and you get the reward. You kill the skeleton, you get the sick sword. That is how these stories are constructed and have been since time immemorial, right? That's coming to us from fairy tale too. They don't. They don't. Again, let's be careful in our language. They don't even shoo the dragon off. Not really, right? Smaug fails to find them because they are effectively hiding, so goes off to take his revenge on Lake Town anyway. And that does put them in an interesting and somewhat complicated position. We'll talk much more about this as we'll move through it. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Where are we now? We're going to hail King Bard. Of course, is our next slide here. And this, just to frame this out a little bit, I talked before about this being the week in which, the fantasy story really is evident. The fantasy story is made manifest. And this, I think, is one perfect example of that. We don't here take the step back. We don't qualify this in terms of, the more avuncular, friendlier, juvenile tone that we've seen previously, right? There's no kind of softening of the edges of this experience. This is harsh, and it is real, and it is brutal, and it is logistical, it is political, right? And all of those things all of those things demonstrate how much we have left the fairy tale behind. They gathered in mournful crowds upon the western shores, shivering in the cold wind, and their first complaints and anger were against the master, who had left the town so soon while some were still willing to defend it. He may have a good head for business, especially his own business, some murmured, but he is no good when anything serious happens. And they praised the courage of Bard and his last mighty shot. If only he had not been killed, they all said, we would make him a king, Bard the dragon shooter of the line of Girion. Alas that he is lost. And in the very midst of their talk, a tall figure stepped from the shadows. He was drenched with water. His black hair hung wet over his face and shoulders, and a fierce light was in his eyes. Bard is not lost, he cried. He dived from Esgaroth, and when the enemy was slain, I am Bard of the line of Girion. I am the slayer of the dragon. King Bard! King Bard! They shouted, but the master ground his chattering teeth. Girion was lord of Dale, not king of Esgaroth, he said. In the Lake Town we have always elected masters from among the old and wise. We have not endured the rule of mere fighting men. Let King Bard go back to his own kingdom. Dale is now freed by his valor, and nothing hinders his return. Any that wish can go with him if they prefer the cold stones under the shadow of the mountain to the green shores of the lake. The wise will stay here and hope to rebuild our town and enjoy again in time its peace and riches. We will have King Bard, the people near at hand shouted in reply. We have had enough of the old man and the money counters. And people further off took up the cry, up the bowman and down with money bags, till the clamour echoed along the shore. Austin's calling out in the chat here, Dragon Shooter, not Dragon Slayer? I know, it's an odd one. It always stands out to me too. I wonder if we are leaving the title, right, the honorific of Dragon Slayer to Bard so that he can claim it when he comes out, right? He's not being granted quite that title just yet. But you're right, Dragon Shooter feels less effective, less conclusive, less heroic perhaps, even though it is, literally the case. It always jumps out to me too, Austin. You're not alone on this at all. So Bard is here, he is safe. Interestingly, right, he is hailed as king before it is revealed that he has survived. This is not just a direct challenge of will, this is not a popularity contest between Bard in the left corner, or in the red corner, and the master in the blue corner, right? There's something else happening here. In this moment of manifest heroism, in this moment of fulfilled prophecy, in this moment of restoration, the good people of Esgaroth have reclaimed their love of the monarchy, right? They no longer want this weird oligarchy that they have established for themselves here on the shores of the lake. They want the righteous, the unconstitutional monarch, as Tolkien himself appeals to in his letters. I mean, who among us here in 2025 don't want to shout up with the bowman and down with money bags, right? This is not the end, of course, of Bard's story by any means, but there is already enough on the page to see Bard as this change in heroic man, right? Capital M, man, this heroic figure of the line of men. Again, moving on from that tragic figure of the earlier legendarium of the First and the Second Age toward someone who is more like Aragorn. And look at what he says as he comes out, right? Referring to himself in the third person, which is just great. He was drenched with water. His black hair hung wet over his face and shoulders. A fierce light was in his eyes. We can sense, I think, this heroic agency that's happening here, right? He is doing the thing that kings are supposed to do, which is taking action. Bard is not lost. He dived from Esgaroth when the enemy was slain. I am Bard of the line of Girion. I am the slayer of the dragon. He plunges into the water like Smaug. He is claimed by fire like Smaug, but he rises again. There is this metaphorical death and rebirth of Bard plunging into the waters of the lake and coming up once more. There's something, well, I mean, depending on how you want to read it, right? There is something in the least connotative sense. There was something magnificent about this. There was something heroic about this. There is something, yes, kind of mythic and kingly about it, right? The king falls and returns. It's not just that he's returning to the ancestral line of kingship. It is he himself physically right now returning. And of course, if we're inclined to read this as a death and a rebirth, we can see certainly messianic characteristics here, particularly as we're just juxtaposing his leadership and authority and agency with, well, moneybags, right? With the master of Lake Town himself. Yeah, Austin says he's cleansed by the fire, the bowman no more, the king reborn from waters of the lake. Beautifully put, Austin. Yes, absolutely. And Louise is saying, how about Feller of Dragons? Feller of Dragons I like. There is just something about Shooter, isn't there? There's something that feels, I don't know. I also, would hesitate about saying, you shoot your bow. I mean, you do shoot bows, right? But that is not like the active heroic verb that I want for that circumstance. But you're right. Yeah, Feller of Dragons is pretty good, actually. Dragon Hewer, right? There's something combative. Although maybe that is a distinction that is being made too. Maybe there is a functional distinction between... I'd have to give this some thought. Maybe the people of Esgaroth are drawing a functional distinction here between Bard's slaying of Smaug and the traditional ways in which dragons are slain, right? He's not standing there with his mighty sword, his black-bladed sword and his great shield and his, dragon helm of Dorloman, to pick a random example. Rather, he is firing this arrow from a great distance, and it is the intercession of the prophecy, right? How many arrows have been fired? All of the archers spend every arrow that they have, and they clatter and rattle off of Smaug's scales, and this one does it. What is the operative mechanism by which Bard slays the dragon? And of course, we know the operative mechanism, but how do the people of Esgaroth understand this operative mechanism? How is it clear to them? I find myself asking now for the first time, what happened? Smaug is immense, and the arrow, though it is fired from a yew bow, right? So a very long bow, we can infer. So maybe this is 3 feet long. This arrow is 3 feet long. How did anyone see it happen? How did anyone know that is what happened? When it plunges into Smaug in its entirety, right? The entire arrow is subsumed into, is taken into the body of Smaug before he rises in the sky and crashes through the town itself. Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I would need to maybe consider that. Yeah, dragon shooter, nonetheless, right? Maybe it is simply that he is the last man standing. Maybe it is simply that he is silhouetted against the fire heroically, right? As the dragon falls. So by implication, he, the archer, maybe that is what we are doing. The dragon shooter, right? The dragon archer might be what we're leaning on there, rather than the idea that it was the arrow that it was specifically the arrow that dealt the fatal blow. I'm not sure. We need to think about that some more. Okay. So, as I say, we're looking here at the beginning of this power struggle between Bard and the Master. And you can see, of course, the Master here leveraging his political acumen, right? We get told, I think, in the next slide that he has his position for a reason. Like, he is good at this. And here he is again, right? Girion was Lord of Dale, not of Esgaroth. He has no right to claim you're fealty, people of Esgaroth. This is where we live now. We have no kings. We have always elected from the old and the wise, right? He's making this appeal to authority here, and have not endured the rule of mere fighting man. And wow, if Tolkien's ideology revealed itself anywhere in this excerpt tonight, it is right here, right? The fighting man is heroic. The fighting man is the hero. Let's move on and take a look at the Master's excellent political pivot here. Not content with his response to Bard, he moves on and starts to pin the blame instead on the dwarves. I am the last man to undervalue Bard the bowman, said the Master warily, for Bard now stood close beside him. He has tonight earned an eminent place in the roll of the benefactors of our town, and he is worthy of many imperishable songs. But why, oh people? And here the Master rose to his feet and spoke very loud and clear. Why do I get all your blame? For what fault am I to be deposed? Who aroused the dragon from his slumber, I might ask? Who obtained of us rich gifts and ample help, and led us to believe the old songs could come true? Who played on our soft hearts and our pleasant fancies? What sort of gold have they sent down the river to reward us? Dragon fire and ruin! From whom should we claim the recompense of our damage and aid for our widows and orphans? As you see, the Master had not got his position for nothing. The result of his word was from that moment the people quite forgot their idea of a new king and turned their angry thoughts toward Thorin and company. Wild and bitter words were shouted from many sides, and some of those who had before sung the old songs loudest were now heard as loudly crying that the dwarves had stirred the dragon up against them deliberately. Fools, said Bard, why waste words and wrath on those unhappy creatures? Doubtless they perished first in fire before Smaug came to us. Then, even as he was speaking, the thought came into his heart of the fabled treasure of the mountain, lying without guard or owner, and he fell suddenly silent. He thought of the Master's words, and of Dale rebuilt and filled with golden bells, if he could but find the man. Here, we can see, I think, a manifestation of the dragon sickness that we are going to be able to discuss more fully. And whether it is a magical dragon sickness, whether there is some dark magic upon the horde of Erebor, or it is simply greed of a more mundane sort, right? If it is just a mighty, unguarded treasure waiting for someone to come and claim it. And of course, we can see Bard performing exactly the kind of rationalizations that people perform in Tolkien's works, that people perform in real life. Let's be clear about that too, right? What does he want to do with the money? Well, he wants to rebuild Dale. He wants to make it great again. He wants to have golden bells. He's not thinking of arming the man of Dale and undertaking great conquest and imperial conduct. He's just thinking about making his home beautiful once again, which is exactly the kind of temptation that we would attribute to the horde of any of the dwarven strongholds, or the Arkenstone, or the rings, of course. We're going to have to skip on a little faster than I wanted to here. I wanted to spend a little more time on the mechanism of the Master and on the politics of this. But again, you know, we live in 2025. I think we're all kind of familiar about the positioning of a common foe as a means of unifying those who would first tear you from your oligarchical position, take you down from your throne. You just have to convince the people that they have a common enemy, and you can, you know, live to fight another day, live to scam another day. Let's move on. Things are hard on the survivors, right? This is where we learn that there's little food, there's little shelter. This is where we learn that fully a quarter of the population of Esgaroth fell. This is where we learn that people are falling ill and dying who survived the dragon attack, right? This is the real kind of logistical nightmare of the fantasy novel. The situation is dire. Bard becomes desperate, and then we pull out again, kind of compounding this narrative maneuver in order to look at the elves. I think we have 2 more slides to get to tonight, which we can probably do and still make it to our bonus episode over in The Green Dragon, where Austin's saying here that the Master was portrayed perfectly by Stephen Fry. I do like it. I do like that performance very much. I do think that the problem in Lake Town is largely Alfred and a kind of thematic confusion. I mean, I love Stephen Fry and have done for many a long years. I think that you know, between Jeeves and Wooster and a bit of Fry and Laurie, Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie together are responsible for, you know, a very large part of my sense of humor and my sense of what is, even in the abstract, amusing. I do think that he's great, but not polished enough for me, right? I would have liked to have seen someone who was a more proficient politician, someone who had really demonstrated not just this brutal authoritarianism, which obviously, again, right, we can recognize from our real life here in 2025, but a kind of political canniness that I'm not sure we ever really see from him. It is a great performance, but it is, you know, it is a take on the Master rather than, you know, the definitive take. With that said, let's pull out all the way to Mirkwood. The Elven King had received news from his own messengers and from the birds that loved his folk, and already knew much of what had happened. Very great indeed was the commotion among all things with wings that dwelt on the borders of the desolation of the dragon. The air was filled with circling flocks, and their swift-flying messengers flew here and there across the sky. Above the borders of the forest there was whistling, crying, and piping. Far over Mirkwood tidings spread, Smaug is dead. Leaves rustled and startled ears were lifted. Even before the Elven King rode forth, the news had passed west right to the pine woods of the Misty Mountains. Beorn had heard it in his wooden house, and the goblins were at council in their caves. That will be the last we hear of Thorin Oakenshield, I fear, said the king. He would have done better to have remained my guest. It is an ill wind all the same, he added, that blows no one any good. For he too had not forgotten the legend of the wealth of Thror. So it was that Bard's messengers found him now marching with many spearmen and bowmen, and crows were gathered thick above him, for they thought that war was awakening again, such as had not been in these parts for a long age. But the king, when he received the prayers of Bard, had pity, for he was the lord of a good and kindly people. So turning his march, which had been at first direct toward the mountain, he hastened now down the river to the long lake. He had not boats or rafts enough for his host, and they were forced to go the slower way by foot, but great store of goods he sent ahead by water. Still, elves are light-footed, and though they were not in those days much used to the marches and the treacherous lands between the forest and the lake, their going was swift. Only 5 days after the death of the dragon, they came upon the shores and looked on the ruins of the town. Their welcome was good, as may be expected, and the men and their master were ready to make any bargain for the future in return of the Elven King's aid. So, I'll credit here, 'tis an ill wind that blows nobody good, credited to John Heywood, a playwright in the court of Henry VIII and his immediate successors, circa 1546. It is, of course, notably repeated by Sam's gaffer, by Hamfast Gamgee, at the end of The Lord of the Rings. So, Smaug dies October 21st. The elves depart from Mirkwood on the 23rd. On the 24th, having received Bard's missives, they change course from the mountain to Lake Town, which they reach on October the 26th. And I want to stress here, because it is something that I think gets shaken out of our interpretive maneuvers. You know, it gets shaken out of our appreciation of exactly what is happening here. The positioning of Thranduil and the host of the Woodland Realm as generous, beneficial, considerate, thoughtful neighbors is a really strong piece of characterization here, right? They are good people, as we were told earlier, and then given little to no proof of their goodness. Here, we really see it. Though it is balanced, even in that moment, with the rapidity with which they take action, right? The message that Smaug is dead passes west with great speed. And as the king says, that will be the last we hear of Thorin Oakenshield. Well, too bad. It would have been better for him if he had stayed in the dungeon. However, that said, there is a ton of treasure in that mountain, and it seems to me that it's wanting of an owner. So we should definitely go. And they immediately set out, right? The elves depart from Mirkwood, as I say, on the 23rd, 2 days after the death of Smaug. Probably a day and a half, honestly, after the death of Smaug. So he is going to claim the treasure. He's going to claim the mountain, but the words of Bard are sufficient to sway him. The words of Bard, the need of the people of Lake Town are sufficient to send the elves south. They send food out across the lake. They themselves cannot be ferried across the lake because they have too few boats, too few rafts, but they have enough that they can send food to the needy survivors of Esgaroth before they themselves even show up. And they move with great rapidity, though, you know, they're unfamiliar with the landscape here. We're seeing a real connection, an alliance, a friendship, an active friendship here between the elves and the men of the Long Lake, which is obviously going to be incredibly significant later. Let's move into our final slide for this evening and wrap up our discussion of Fire and Water. Their plans were soon made. With the women and the children, the old and the unfit, the master remained behind, and with him were some men of crafts and many skilled elves, and they busied themselves felling trees and collecting the timber sent down from the forest. Then they set about raising many huts by the shore against the oncoming winter. But also under the master's direction, they began the planning of a new town, designed more fair and large than ever than before, but not in the same place. They removed northward, higher up the shore, for ever had they a dread of the water where the dragon lay. He would never again return to his golden bed, but it was stretched cold as stone twisted upon the floor of the shallows. There for ages his huge bones could be seen in calm weather amid the ruined piles of the old town. But few dared to cross this cursed spot, and none dared to dive into the shivering water or recover the precious stones that fell from his rotting carcass. But all the men of arms who were still able, and the most of the Elven King's array, got ready to march north to the mountain. It was thus that in 11 days from the ruin of the town, the head of their host passed the rock gates at the end of the lake and came into the desolate lands. November 2nd, 11 days, as the text tells us, after the death of Smaug, and the army of elves and men is now there, present. I somehow cancelled out of that slideshow. Oh no. And I have started again from the beginning. I will take care of that off here to the side. So we get this functional alliance. We get the rebuilding of a kind of lake town, but we also get this brilliant kind of mythic interruption here. The idea that the falling of Smaug has borne forth a new myth in this place. That what we're about to see is going to be motivated largely by money, right? It's going to be motivated largely by treasure, by the dragon horde. But money itself, riches themselves, cannot quite motivate the men of Lake Town, the new and improved Lake Town, to go diving into the waters where Smaug is. And they can see him forever after, for ages after. They can see, when the water of the lake is low, the bones of Smaug, right? They can see them right there in the water. And they know that he was bedecked, encrusted by gold, by gems. There is an enormous wealth right there for the taking, but the compulsion of that wealth is insufficient. No one is going to dare to dive into that water, not even the master, which of course means, I believe, was it Austin earlier in the chat who was pointing out that Bard does not, for all that he says to his black arrow, does not in fact go and recover his black arrow. Presumably it is lost forever. Unless he climbs out, I guess we don't get proof of this, right? But if he climbs out of the water, standing there on the shore, I am Bard, King of Dale, whatever, and he's got the black arrow in his hand, that might be a way around that. We might be able to encompass that in our interpretive maneuver here. Let me fast forward here through the slides that I have put down here so that I can... No, not Austin. Well, someone was real smart in the chat, but there are a lot of you this evening, which is lovely, and I'm afraid I haven't completely kept up with everyone right here. So a quick note here as we really do approach the end of our show for tonight, approach the end of our time. Obviously, there has been some delay in the production of this podcast. The way that it has worked out is that I'm functionally taking a week off for Thanksgiving. I know, it's Monday night, but here we are. I will be back at our regular Sunday slot for Shire Reckoning this coming week and our regular Tuesday slot next week. So I'm kind of taking a week off, but I've done that by moving last week's show into the middle of this week. So that is where we are. We're not going to hopefully miss another session. And if I can get to the slide that displays our schedule, then I shall. In the meantime, I will let you know that if you are listening to this live and you support Next Word over on patreon.com/nextword, then you can join me, as I say, in just 10 minutes or whatever for a little bonus episode. I'm going to go and pour some whiskey. I'm going to make a Manhattan inspired by Andrea here. I'm going to go and make a Manhattan, and then we're going to talk some more about dragons, and I'm going to discuss some other archetypes, other draconic archetypes, which are some of my very favorites. So we're going to talk about that later, and we'll maybe pick up on some of the destruction of Lake Town too. But next week, let me share this out here. December 2nd, that will be next Tuesday night, believe it or not. Chapter 15, The Gathering of the Clouds, and then December 9th, Chapter 16, A Thief in the Night. We're going to have so much to talk about. It really is such a rich text. Not to suggest that it hasn't been a rich text previously, but as we complete our maneuver into the fantasy narrative here, there's just so much to discuss. Louise is saying that she hated the Stephen Fry portrayal, but she loves Fry in everything, and the Harry Potter audiobooks and Sherlock Holmes canon are his. I am very much. I know that there is disagreement about this. I know that there is contest and confusion about this. I am absolutely a Stephen Fry Harry Potter audiobook guy, I have to say. I think that his work is very good, and not to discredit Jim Dale, isn't it, who reads the American ones, of course, noted narrator of such things. But for me, I mean, it's Stephen Fry. what else can be said except that? That is going to do it for tonight's episode of Shire Reckoning. Thank you guys so much for being with me. If you have thoughts, if you have further subjects that you want to delve into, then by all means get in touch. You can reach me shirereckoningpod@gmail.com. You can find me at Shire Reckoning Pod on mostly just Blue Sky. That's where I am these days. If you want to come and hang out there, as I've said before, it's like Twitter back when Twitter was good. That's less true than it was. But if you are careful and you kind of moderate your own experience of the place, if you are liberal with the block button, then it's very much like Twitter back when Twitter was good. So come and hang out over there, and we can talk Tolkien late into the night. Louise is asking, on a similar topic, have we covered audiobooks of Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings? I'm an Inglis fan. I mean, Rob Inglis, he is definitive. Like, there is a positionality that we associate with the English books. I think that is just, there is a seniority, might be the best way to put it, right? I think that, I dare say that the English versions are the ones which are most commonly read, are most widespread. They are the ones with which we are most familiar. I think that I really love his work. I did listen earlier this year to the Andy Serkis versions of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion, in fact, which I think are great, but are almost too performative to be transparent to the reader, right? I'm so interested in this idea of transparency in terms of media, where you're engaging with a form of art, and the delivery mechanism of that form of art does not in any way intrude into your experience of that thing, right? You're watching TV, and you yourself are not aware that you are watching TV. You are transported by the skill of the storytelling that you're engaging with, right? Or you're, better yet, in the movie theater. You're rarely, I think, conscious of being in the movie theater when you're in the movie theater, because the film is right there and it's gigantic and it's taking over everything that you have. So you are simply immersed in the story. And I found it very difficult to be immersed in the Serkis recordings, because he is so painstaking in his pronunciation, because he is so performative. I enjoy it very much as a performance, but as a delivery mechanism for the story, as a means of receiving the story unimpeded, I found it a little harder to kind of really connect with, honestly. But I do really I admire the performance a great deal, and his pronunciation is really impeccable. He obviously worked with good. Oh, and Austin's calling out Inglis's narration of Wizard of Earthsea. Fantastic. Yeah, Wizard of Earthsea has been coming up so much lately. I've got to find an excuse to talk about Wizard of Earthsea, I guess is where we are. Okay, let's wrap it up there. Thank you guys so much for being with me this evening. It's been so much fun chatting about Tolkien with you. I hope you'll be able to join me next Tuesday for The Gathering of Clouds, as we are tremulous on the brink of open conflict here in the pages of The Hobbit. And we've only got a few more chapters to go, so it's going to be a lot of fun. Until then, I hope you'll be able to join me after this for the after show. But if not, I will be back next week with more. Until then, please do take care, and Aure and Teluva. Good night, all.